Welcome everyone. As you surely gathered from the title, today we're doing a deep dive into economic methodology, which I know, believe me, I know sounds extremely boring. But even if you have no idea what economics is, it's actually a really interesting topic. You'll just have to trust me on that for now. And yes, I do know how tall an ask that is. Economics isn't called the dismal science for nothing after all. No. It tends to be called that because it's associated with dry questions that have no clear-cut answers, even from economists themselves. Questions like, is the stock market going to go up tomorrow? Which, if we knew that, we wouldn't be economists anymore, you can trust me on that. Or, the ever-favorite of politicians and pundits, how do we stop unemployment from getting worse? In fact, if you ask the average person what economics even is, they'll tell you it's basically the science that answers these types of questions. And if you ask a more well-informed person, they'll tell you it's the science that fails to answer those types of questions. And that's actually for reasons we'll take a look at throughout this video essay. But what people don't realize is that economics as a discipline goes way beyond predicting next week's financial headlines. You can actually think about it as a framework for understanding a far broader set of behavioral questions. Even questions like, why do people get married? Or how can we keep crime rates low? You're probably thinking, seriously? These nerds with their spreadsheets and graphs think they can explain marriage and crime? Shouldn't these topics be left to philosophers or maybe even a therapist if things have really gone south? And you wouldn't be wrong on a superficial level. In fact, most people could come up with answers to those questions without ever once consulting an economist. But then again, most people also thought the world was flat at one point. So what is economics really? It's a question that this episode, and this entire series, is dedicated to answering. Let's start with the obvious when tackling these sorts of questions: the dictionary definition. According to Merriam-Webster, economics is a social science concerned chiefly with the description and analysis of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. That sounds official, right? The kind of thing you'd copy-paste into a high school term paper when you're 5 minutes away from the deadline. But does it actually tell us what economics is? Sure, it's a social science, no argument from me there. But beyond that, it's completely empty verbiage. Production, distribution, and consumption. You know who else describes those things? Accountants. And last I checked, they weren't being hailed as economists or being nominated for Nobel Prizes. Not at all. To really understand what economics is, we need to look past these sanitized definitions and turn to one of the greatest economic minds of the 20th century, if not all time. Enter Ludwig von Mises. And trust me, his name is one you'll hear a lot if you stick around. While many of his contemporaries spent their time building castles in the clouds, Mises built a towering intellectual edifice that has withstood a century's worth of criticism. The guy didn't just dabble in economics, he defined it. Mises gave us a definition of economics that cuts straight through the nonsense. He described it as the study of human action under conditions of scarcity. Now I know what you're thinking. That's it? That's the grand theory of economics? Yes, I know, it's a deceptively simple definition, but don't be fooled. It's like the philosophical equivalent of a Russian nesting doll, layers within layers, and those layers are what we'll be unpacking throughout this episode. So let's start with the first layer, and the most obvious piece, scarcity. Now, scarcity doesn't just mean there's a shortage of money or oil or whatever resource is making headlines this week. No. Scarcity refers to the simple, unavoidable fact that there's never enough of anything to go around because we have infinitely broad desires. That includes the natural resources you'd expect, sure, like copper or iron, but also intangible things like time, attention, or even sleep. Scarcity is everywhere, and because of that, economics touches everything. It's not just the science of money or resources. It's the science of how humans make decisions in a world where they can't have it all. And trust me, no one, absolutely no one, is more aware of that reality than economists. They've got their fingers in so many pies because scarcity is the basic condition of existence. But that's only half the story. The second layer, and the second part of Mises' definition, is human action. So what exactly is human action? Well, according to Mises, it's just a synonym for purposeful behavior. It's what separates humans from animals who simply act on instinct or impulse. Mises elaborates further, saying that human action is the ego's meaningful response to its environment. We're not just reacting to stimuli like a dog chasing its tail. We're adjusting ourselves to the world around us, trying to improve our situation. We imagine a future where things could be better, where we're happier, healthier, wealthier, and then we act in ways we think will bring that future about. Murray Rothbard, Mises' student, takes it a step further. He defines human action as purposeful behavior directed towards satisfying wants that would otherwise remain unfulfilled. In other words, we don't just act for the sake of it. We act because we want something, whether it's food, comfort, or maybe just a better parking spot. Rational action is what sets us apart from other animals. It's what makes us capable of understanding cause and effect, and more importantly, acting on that knowledge to improve our lot in life. Think of the material world as a giant piano. It's just there, inert and useless on its own. But a skilled musician, a human, can engage with that piano and produce a melody, crafting something beautiful from lifeless objects. The piano doesn't play itself, just like the world doesn't shape itself. It's human reason, imagination, and purposeful action that rearranges the world into something valuable, meaningful, and useful. Now, none of this is breaking news to you, I'm sure. But believe it or not, this view of human action is wildly controversial in academic circles. Most philosophers, and even a good number of economists, are some flavor of determinist. To them, human action is just the byproduct of biological impulses, environmental conditioning, or a chaotic mix of random factors. Free will? Purpose? Those are fairy tales right up there with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. According to them, what we experience as choice is just a superficial epiphenomenon, like bubbles on top of the real forces that are actually pulling the strings. Now, I'm not going to spend this video debunking determinism, though I could, and you'd find it entertaining. But for now, it's enough to say that whether determinism is true or not, studying economics with that mindset is, well, it's about as productive as studying astronomy through a kaleidoscope. The truth is, if you want to understand the world, and I mean really understand it, you have to start by understanding human action. Attempts to explain social phenomena through abstract nouns or collectivist forces, like how most sociologists try to go about things, are ultimately futile. It's not society or the market that makes decisions. Individuals do. And those decisions, driven by reason and purpose, are what shape the material world. This is why Austrian economists are often called methodological individualists. Finally, this brings us to the whole phrase, the final layer, if you will, the study of human action, which is where things start to get interesting. And by interesting, I mean the kind of academic catfight that only a few diehard academics actually care about. So buckle up. This debate is raging deep within the bowels of the economics profession. But you wouldn't know it. Why is that? Well, for one thing, it's because the general public is blissfully unaware, having been trained to think of economics as something only experts with advanced degrees and questionable social skills can understand. Also, this debate is wildly lopsided. Think the Spartans versus the Persians at Thermopylae. On one side we have the vast, and I do mean vast majority of economists. Let's call them the logical positivists. They're the tribe that worships at the altars of philosophers Karl Popper and A.J. Ayer. These are your true believers in the scientific method, the technocrats who look at the world through the cold, hard, unfeeling lens of data. For them, all knowledge can be neatly sorted into two buckets: analytic and empirical. It's a comforting worldview, especially if you're not someone who enjoys thinking too hard or, questioning your assumptions. The first bucket, analytic knowledge, is just a collection of definitions. Ostensive definitions are where you point at something green and say, "This is green." Groundbreaking stuff, right? Stipulative definitions, meanwhile, are even more thrilling. Things like, "A bachelor is an unmarried man." The kind of tautological statements people use when they want to sound intelligent without actually saying anything of substance. You'll meet plenty of them at cocktail parties. The second bucket is where the logical positivists really start to froth at the mouth. And understandably so. This bucket is empirical knowledge, and it's where the real fun begins. You come up with a hypothesis, you test it, you observe, and if you're very, very lucky, you don't blow up the lab in the process. The positivists cling to this method like it's the last life raft on a sinking ship. But here's the thing, only hypotheses that can be falsified count. If your theory can't be falsified, it's not just wrong, it's irrelevant. It goes straight into the metaphysical dumpster, right alongside astrology and dialectical materialism. Now, at first glance, all this might sound like the sine qua non of scientific rigor. But here's where the cracks start to appear in the positivist facade. Because, wait for it, you can never fully confirm a hypothesis. There's always another variable you didn't account for, always a reason why things didn't go exactly as planned. It's why socialism didn't work in the Soviet Union. Maybe Stalin's mustache was too thick, or Trotsky's haircut just wasn't revolutionary enough. Under the positivist framework, you can make any excuse, and as long as it's falsifiable in principle, it goes. And that, my friends, is where this whole thing starts to reek of pseudoscience, or at the very least as a step backward from Immanuel Kant. But wait, it gets even better. Despite all their talk about the supremacy of science and empiricism, logical positivism has this one giant glaring hole: mathematics and logic, both of which are supposedly just tautologies and therefore irrelevant, somehow manage to apply to everything we experience in the real world. It's almost as if the universe was designed that way. Funny that, huh? And then we get to the ethical implications of this worldview, which will no doubt warm the hearts of any psychopaths in the audience. According to logical positivism, ethical statements are just quaint relics of a pre-scientific era. They're nothing more than guttural noises. So when you say it's wrong to kick old ladies in the shins for fun, you're really just saying, I don't like kicking old ladies. Both statements in this framework are no more morally significant than I like ice cream, or I dislike Brussels sprouts. Basically, ethics gets demoted to the level of caveman grunting. Now, let's drive the final nail into the positivist coffin, shall we? The grand statement at the heart of logical positivism is, there can only be analytic or empirical truths, is itself neither analytic nor empirical. Think about it. Really think about its implications, and you'll find it's a metaphysical claim. It's a non-falsifiable truth that can't be tested, but is somehow expected to be accepted as gospel. And with that, the entire edifice collapses under the weight of its own contradiction, like a Jenga tower that never stood a chance. With that said, we can talk about the rival to logical positivism, what we're really here for, the intellectual antagonist waiting in the wings. Praxeology. If logical positivism is the overzealous bureaucrat of modern economics, obsessed with data points, hypotheses, and graphs, then praxeology is the suave, cigarette-smoking outsider who strolls into the room with a knowing smirk. He doesn't need a bar chart to explain why human beings act the way they do. Praxeology is what happens when economics, philosophy, and common sense all decide to sit down together and politely explain to the mainstream why they're embarrassing themselves. So what exactly is praxeology? Well, as many things do in the Austrian economist milieu, the term comes to us courtesy of Ludwig von Mises, and it refers to the study of human action, but specifically those aspects of human action that can be understood a priori, which is what differentiates economics from psychology. Now, for those of you who didn't spend your weekends reading dead philosophers, a priori means knowledge that you can grasp without needing to run a single lab experiment or dig through reams of data. In other words, praxeology doesn't care about your fancy econometric models or your endless statistical analyses. Instead, it focuses on the conceptual analysis and logical implications of things like human choice, preferences, and the means-ends relationships that guide every decision we make. And here's where praxeology gets fun. You see, unlike the positivists who are forever obsessed with data but seem to end up disappointed most of the time, praxeologists understand something much deeper. That human action, while messy and unpredictable on the surface, is governed by logical, unbreakable laws. Positivists look at us like we're malfunctioning robots. Praxeologists, meanwhile, see us as creatures of purpose, desire, and intent, beings capable of making choices, not just blindly reacting to stimuli like lab rats. Let's take a quick historical detour. This will be important in a few episodes. The principles of praxeology weren't cooked up in some think tank or research lab. They were first discovered by the ancient Greeks. Yes, those same chiton-wearing philosophers who gave us democracy, tragic theater, and the occasional plate of olives. They figured out something crucial. Human action has structure, and from that structure you can derive various important ethical, economic, and even philosophical truths. The Greeks, being the virtuous types they were, of course, used this insight to build out their concept of eudaimonia, a fancy word for living a good, flourishing life. Fast forward a few centuries and the scholastics took this praxeological insight and just ran with it. They applied it to economics and the other social sciences, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the Austrian School of Economics we know and love today. Unfortunately, the Enlightenment came along and kinda sorta ruined everything for a while. You see, Enlightenment thinkers were obsessed with reducing humans to predictable automata. There you see the influence of Descartes, of course. Just soulless cogs in a mechanistic universe, and they happily tossed out anything that couldn't be quantified or turned into an equation. But don't worry, praxeology wasn't dead. In the late 19th century, Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School, rediscovered it. And Menger, followed by Mises, brought praxeology back from the intellectual graveyard. Mises, being the ever-diligent thinker that he was, formalized praxeology and made it the centerpiece of his economic method. His students like Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard followed suit, using praxeology to expose the logical fallacies that plague so much of mainstream economics. The Austrians understood something that still escapes most economists today. Economics isn't about plugging numbers into a model and hoping for the best. It's about understanding the logical structure of human action, how people make choices, how they prioritize their preferences, and how their decisions impact the world around them. While the rest of the economic world was busy obsessing over stats and regressions, the Austrians were quietly pointing out that most of what passes for economic theory today is not just flawed, it's completely incoherent. Praxeology, on the other hand, works in a way that's so refreshingly simple, it almost feels like a slap in the face. Instead of throwing you into a blizzard of numbers and equations, it starts with one obvious fact. Human beings act purposefully. That's it. Humans act with intent. From this one undeniable truth, you can logically deduce all the core economic principles that actually matter. And once you view economics through this lens, all those complicated terms and concepts that economists try to baffle you with start to make a whole lot more sense. Scarcity is the driving force, human needs and reason are the response, and the way people shape the world around them follows from that. Economic terminology becomes a lot clearer when you remember that it all stems from people trying to solve real-life problems, not from equations someone made up in a textbook. Hans Hermann Hoppe, one of the Austrian School's big thinkers, breaks it down very nicely. He explains that all true economic theorems consist of three key elements: an understanding of human action, which just means recognizing that people do things for a reason, a given situation or change, something happens in the world and we describe it in terms of human action, like choice or opportunity cost, and finally, a logical deduction of consequences. How will an actor respond to this situation and what will happen as a result? Notice how there's nothing about maximizing utility graphs or statistical regressions. It's just about people acting, reacting, and the logical consequences that flow from that. This is the core of the Austrian approach to economics. It's not trying to impress you with mathematical gymnastics or to make economics look more scientific by piling on layers upon layers of unnecessary quantitative analysis. Instead, the goal is to understand the causal processes, what's actually happening when people make decisions, and how those decisions shape the economy. It's a method grounded in logical deduction, thought experiments, and, brace yourself for this one, common sense. Now I can already hear the mainstream economists groaning. That sounds too simplistic, too old-fashioned, they'll cry. After all, isn't economics a science? And aren't we in the age of data? Come on, we've got computer models, spreadsheets, and thousands of PhDs crunching numbers. Surely you're not suggesting we throw all that out for some dusty old theory from the 40s. The more intellectually honest ones might try a more nuanced approach. Okay, they'll concede. We get that logical positivism is a steaming dumpster fire of contradictions. And sure, praxeology seems philosophically airtight if a bit vintage. But hey, positivism works just fine in physics, chemistry, and biology. Why not just graft it onto economics? If it's good enough for sending rockets to the moon and splitting atoms, it's probably good enough for predicting GDP growth, right? Now I can see why that might be a reasonable position. In fact, I can already hear the self-satisfied pat on the back they're giving themselves for being so pragmatic. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, they think. Science works, so why shouldn't it work in economics? Well, they've just stepped into the intellectual quagmire that is pragmatic philosophy. That delightfully American idea that if something works, it must be right. Never mind whether it's logically consistent or, even remotely applicable to the domain in question. Sure, let's take the tools we use to test the tensile strength of bridge cables and apply them to human behavior. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, a lot. Because while the scientific method is great for building rockets and curing diseases, it's about as useful in economics as a parachute made of lead. Here's why. The natural sciences work because they deal with a reality that is blissfully indifferent to your feelings, your opinions, or your poorly thought out hot takes. Drop a ball from a building and gravity does its thing, whether you want it to or not. Atoms don't have mood swings, molecules don't wake up one morning and decide they'd rather be doing something else. Nature operates under fixed laws, constants, and repeatable phenomena. That's the beauty of the scientific method. You isolate the variables, control the conditions, and repeat the experiment until you're sure that X causes Y. It's neat, predictable, and most importantly, replicable. But here's where the mainstream economists trip over their own feet. Economics isn't physics. Trying to apply the same method to economics is like trying to perform brain surgery with a chainsaw. You'll make a lot of noise, but the results will be horrifying, and they've often been. The core problem? In economics, you lose the one thing that science needs to function: replicability. In the natural sciences, you can run the same experiment 1,000 times under the same conditions and get the exact same results. Drop the apple, it falls. Mix the chemicals, they react. Measure the speed of light, and it's always the same. It doesn't change because Mercury is in retrograde or because you had a bad day at work. Now step into economics and all that goes out the window. In this field, the variables aren't just unpredictable. They're sentient. People, those messy, willful creatures who make up the economy, do not behave like subatomic particles. They don't follow the same sort of fixed, immutable laws that particles do. You can't run the same economic experiment twice because the very act of doing it changes the conditions. Heraclitus was right. You never step into the same river twice. Every new piece of information reshuffles the entire economic deck. People's preferences change, circumstances evolve, and decisions driven by subjective values don't conform to neat mechanical determinism. Ludwig von Mises saw this with blinding clarity in human action. He eviscerated the fantasy that we can apply quantitative methods to economics in any meaningful way. The reason, as Mises pointed out, is that there are no constant relationships between the so-called economic dimensions. In physics, we have constants like gravity, big G as it's called. In economics, good luck finding anything that predictable. Every new tax policy, technological innovation, or even just a celebrity endorsement scrambles the price structure completely. There's no fixed law of supply and demand guaranteeing that a 1% increase in price will always lead to a predictable decrease in demand. Why? Because value is subjective. What someone is willing to pay for on a good day might change tomorrow, based on everything from their financial situation to whether their favorite influencer just told them to buy something else. And trying to isolate variables in an economy is just as difficult. In the natural sciences, it's easy to control your experiment. You lock all the relevant variables in a box, you measure them, and voila, you've got data. But in economics, the real world is your only lab, and it's a chaotic mess. You can't put the economy in a petri dish and isolate the variables like you would a chemical reaction. Every day brings new information, new preferences, new choices, all of which change the conditions under which economic decisions are made. It's like trying to map the stars while someone keeps moving your telescope. But the real killer, the fatal flaw in quantitative economics, is that it completely misunderstands what actually matters. Mainstream economists obsessed with their aggregates, GDP, inflation, unemployment, have convinced themselves that these numbers reveal some deeper truth about the economy. In reality, these aggregates are nothing more than surface-level distractions, not the real drivers of economic behavior. They're the flickering shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, diverting economists from the true forces at play: human action, individual choice, and subjective value. Mainstream economists, at least the more honest ones, know this. They know deep down that their models aren't as solid as they want to believe, and so they turn to the intellectual get-out-of-jail-free card that is pragmatism. They say, okay, maybe our models aren't perfect, but they work well enough. We're able to make some predictions and the economy's still standing, right? I mean, barely, but that's a whole other topic. And that's where pragmatism steps in like the intellectual equivalent of duct tape. It's not about making sure the foundations of your theory are sound or even consistent. It's about making sure everything looks like it's holding together just long enough to call it a success. Pragmatism is basically saying, it works most of the time, and that's good enough for us. Here's the dirty little secret. Most mainstream economists are pragmatists, whether they admit it or not. They know that their models are built on shaky ground, that their predictions often fail, that their beloved formulas can't handle the complexity of real-world human behavior. But instead of reevaluating their methods from the ground up, they settle for good enough. It's not that they don't see the flaws. It's that they've decided those flaws are acceptable as long as the models work occasionally. Sure, they think, we missed the financial crisis, but hey, who could have predicted that? Well, the Austrians did, but again, that's a topic for another day. Mainstream economists, meanwhile, cling to their spreadsheets like their security blankets, telling themselves that if the numbers line up, they must be on the right track. Pragmatism is their shield against the uncomfortable reality that economics is fundamentally different from the natural sciences. In physics, if your theory doesn't hold up under repeated testing, you scrap it and find a better one. In economics, if your model fails, you tweak a variable or two, slap a new coat of paint on it, and keep moving forward. Pragmatism allows them to avoid the philosophical reckoning that Austrian economists have been hammering home for decades. Economics isn't about hard data or equations, it's about human action. Until they accept that, they'll keep running into walls. Alright, so you've made it this far and haven't thrown your device across the room yet, which is impressive. Maybe you're a glutton for punishment, or maybe you just really enjoy mainstream economists walking into intellectual walls. Either way, it's time to reward you with something more concrete. We've been rolling around in abstract theories and philosophical mud long enough, so let's get real and see how these differences in perspective apply to the real world. And let's do that by talking about rent control, a policy that politicians love to champion and economists with Excel spreadsheets love to defend, even though anyone with half a brain knows it's a disaster waiting to happen. Rent control is the quintessential looks good on a bumper sticker policy. A politician, let's call him Steve, is running for office in a city where rents are skyrocketing because, surprise, surprise, there's a housing shortage. Now, Steve's not about to do something difficult like, fix the actual supply problem by making it easier to build more housing. No, that would require long-term thinking and a backbone. Instead, he needs a quick fix to look like a hero, something that'll get him through the next election cycle with minimum effort. So naturally, he turns to rent control, because it's cheap, easy, and makes people clap at campaign rallies. Now here comes the mainstream economist, clipboard in hand, grinning like he just unlocked the secrets of the universe. He's been waiting for this moment. Rent control, he says, is going to save the city. He fires up his spreadsheets and starts crunching numbers. Look, we'll cap rents at $1,500 a month in areas where the average rent has ballooned to $2,500 a month. That's $1,000 in savings for renters, which means they'll have more disposable income. With all that extra cash, they'll go out and spend more at local businesses, restaurants, shops, whatever. This increase in consumer spending will boost the local economy, create jobs, and hey, while we're at it, GDP will go up too. Everybody wins! Now, at this point, the mainstream economist is practically expecting his Nobel Prize. He's got his model all laid out, $100 million in extra consumer spending, a 2% increase in local GDP, thousands of new jobs. According to his aggregates, rent control is going to be the policy that solves everything from housing shortages to climate change. It's perfect. It's foolproof. Except it's not. You see, the problem with the mainstream economist is that he treats the economy like it's a machine full of gears and levers. Change one variable and the rest fall into place, just like physics. But the economy isn't a machine. It's made up of people who don't give a damn about his carefully calibrated models. They care about incentives. And when you throw rent control into the mix, you aren't just tweaking a gear, you're throwing a wrench into the whole system. Here's what actually happens when you slap on rent control. First up, landlords, who, contrary to the belief of mainstream economists, aren't faceless robots built in a lab to milk renters dry. They're people, often middle-class folks who own a couple of properties as an investment. Before rent control, they were charging $2,500 a month because that's what the market said the apartment was worth. They've got mortgages to pay, maintenance to handle, property taxes, and maybe, just maybe, a little profit at the end of the day to justify all the hassle. But now Steve's rent control policy comes along and tells them they can only charge $1,500 a month. So what do you think happens? Do they say, oh sure, let me take that $1,000 hit because I'm just so passionate about affordable housing? Yeah, right. What they're actually going to do is stop maintaining their properties. The roof's leaking? Tough luck. The elevator's broken? Take the stairs. Why spend money keeping the building in shape when they're not even making enough to break even? But that's just the beginning. Some landlords, the ones with enough sense and financial flexibility, will just take their apartments off the rental market altogether. They'll turn them into short-term vacation rentals, because those aren't subject to rent control, or they'll sell the property to someone who wants to use it for something else. Suddenly, there are fewer rental units available, and what was already a tight housing market is now a super tight housing market. But don't worry, Steve's still out there patting himself on the back, and the mainstream economist is fiddling with his spreadsheet, probably adding a new column for unexpected supply contraction. Meanwhile, tenants are sitting in dilapidated rent-controlled apartments praying that their ceilings don't collapse. But hey, at least they're paying $1,500 a month, right? And whatever you do, don't ask them to move. Once you leave a rent-controlled unit, good luck finding another apartment anywhere near that price. You're stuck. Rent control essentially traps people in their apartments, even if they'd prefer to move somewhere else. It kills mobility, which, by the way, is one of the best ways to improve someone's economic prospects. So not only are you stuck in a crumbling apartment, but you're also stuck in a dead-end neighborhood because rent control just made it impossible for you to move somewhere better. But don't worry, mainstream economists have a plan for that too. We'll just pass more regulations, they say, with the confidence of a guy who's never actually spoken to a landlord or tenant in his life. We'll make it illegal for landlords to neglect their properties. We'll force them to keep maintaining the buildings. And if they don't, we'll fine them. Brilliant. So now landlords are legally required to spend money maintaining properties that they're losing money on. That'll really get the housing market humming again, won't it? Here's the thing. You can pass all the regulations you want, but you can't regulate away basic economics. You can't just tell landlords to act against their own financial interests and expect them to smile and say, "Sure thing, boss." They'll either find a way around the rules, hello black market side payments, or they'll simply take their properties off the market altogether. And if you think developers are rushing in to build new housing in a rent-controlled city, I've got a bridge to sell you. No one in their right mind is going to invest in new housing under these conditions. Why bother building apartments if the government's going to cap your profits and regulate you to death? So what does rent control actually do? It creates slumlords, reduces the supply of available housing, and screws over renters who are now stuck in crappy apartments they can't leave. But sure, the mainstream economists will show you a graph that proves rent prices have stabilized. So, mission accomplished, right? So where does all this leave us? Well, if you've stuck with me through this intellectual demolition derby, congratulations. You've officially graduated from the School of Mainstream Economics as a dumpster fire. We've waded knee-deep through the muck of aggregate analysis, exposed the sterile pseudoscience that mainstream economists worship like it's going to save their souls, and watched how policies like rent control disintegrate the moment they collide with the harsh reality of human action. We've put on Mises's glasses and, shockingly, discovered that when you actually pay attention to individual choices, subjective value, and how people really behave, the world looks a lot different than the technocrats and bureaucrats want you to believe. It turns out that the economy isn't a spreadsheet. It's not a machine with neat little inputs and outputs that can be optimized by some grad student with a knack for Excel and a fetish for aggregates. It's messy. It's driven by human beings acting in their own interest, responding to incentives, and constantly adjusting to new information. It's real life, not a lab experiment. But hey, don't get too comfortable. We're just getting started. Smashing the idols of mainstream economic methodology is fun, sure, but it's only the appetizer. In the next episode, we're going to shift gears and dive headfirst into the good stuff. Real economic theory. The kind that doesn't make your brain feel like it's been run through a blender full of pseudoscientific jargon. I'm talking about Karl Menger and the Austrian School. You know, the guy who actually understood that value is subjective and that economics is about understanding human behavior, not about making wild guesses with some fancy equations. We're going to explore Menger's revolutionary insights into how value is created, how he flipped the script on classical economics and laid the foundation for everything that makes sense in economic theory today. No more of this nonsense where we pretend that GDP, inflation, and unemployment are these mystical forces we can control from some ivory tower. No more treating individuals like faceless data points in a game of macroeconomic bingo. Next time we're going back to the source, back to the basics, back to a time when economics was about people, not numbers. So if you're ready to finally understand how the world really works, how markets, trade, and value creation actually happen, then buckle up. The mainstream economists may have their aggregates, but we've got Karl Menger. And trust me, we're about to school them.